A mother's love has long been used as a way to measure love. You've maybe heard the expression, he's got a face only a mother could love. I hope that's never been said of you, but you've probably heard that expression. But mothers kind of set the standard for what love looks like. Mothers, you have a tremendous capacity to love. And I believe that's a reflection of us, all of us as human beings, being made in God's image. God created human beings in his image. And so men and fathers have are able to display a certain characteristic, a certain area of God's nature and character. And in women and mothers, we see other characteristics of God's nature reflected very clearly. The capacity to love powerfully and unconditionally and sacrificially, I think, is something that is one of the things that we see in women and mothers that help us to see God more clearly. But a mother's love can only go so far. There's only so many things a mother can do, and there's certain things that she cannot do for her children. In the Bible text that we're looking at this morning, we see one of those situations. It's a story that Dave already read, the story of the widow who had lost her son. She'd lost her son, and she couldn't do anything about it. When Jesus comes across the scene, so much has already happened. Jesus just comes along the scene at the very last minute, seeing the widow and the crowd of people from the village bringing the son towards his burial. But when Jesus comes along, we see that the situation completely changed. Jesus saw the situation. He had compassion on her. He touched her dead son, and the young man was raised from the dead again. I don't know where you're at this morning as mothers or fathers or grandparents. Maybe there's things or areas that you are concerned about your children, circumstances that are beyond your control. You see things that you can do nothing about. If that's the case, I think the encouragement for us this morning as we look at this text is to entrust your children to God, to trust Jesus with your kids. I know there's people here this morning who could stand up and give a testimony of how there has been concern about how things have been going with their children in a negative direction or something that's been a problem, and in entrusting them to Jesus, God has done miracles. God has changed the situation. I know there's people who could come up here right now and share a testimony like that. He is faithful. And so let's look together at this passage that reminds us of Jesus' faithfulness to us and to our children. In verse 11, first, we see what the problem is. In the Gospels, we've read many situations where the sick were brought to Jesus and they were healed. This young man wasn't just sick. This young man was dead. He was gone. One of the most tragic things I think a parent could ever experience is the loss of one of their children. I know I've been to funerals, and maybe you have as well, or maybe you walked with people who have lost a child, and it's a heartbreaking situation, and it's one of those things where you often hear the words, "It's not supposed to happen this way. I'm the one that's supposed to be going first." It's a tragedy, but there are times where a child passes before the parent. And we can only imagine the devastation that this woman was experiencing. Think about the loss that she had experienced and had already experienced. It says she was a widow. So she'd already gone through the whole process of losing her husband. And they had one son together, and now she's lost that one son. We don't know a lot of the backstory behind this. We don't know if there was an illness, maybe a prolonged illness that she had to walk with her son through or care for. That's a possibility. We don't know. But we do know that the death has already taken place. There's the tragedy of that. There's the tragedy then of preparing for the funeral. And like I said, this is the very last stage in the process as they're moving down towards now burying their son. And so as it's almost over, as this procession is moving towards the cemetery, that's when Jesus and his disciples, and it says a crowd of people, arrive on the scene. And we're told that in verse 12, we see that as this is taking place, Jesus sees the scene. He understands it. But then not only do we see that Jesus sees the problem, we secondly see that he has compassion on her. Verse 13 tells us that. It says, when the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. And so you know what? It wasn't just the situation that he saw. When they came into the village, he didn't just see a funeral procession. He didn't just see a body being carried. He didn't just see a crowd of people that were moving in a funeral. It says, when Jesus saw her, Jesus saw the woman. He saw the widow. He saw the one who had experienced the greatest loss in this. And it says that when he saw her, he had compassion. His heart overflowed with compassion for her. Mothers, as you love your children and you hurt for them and you worry about them, and as you have concern for them, Jesus sees you. He sees your worry. He sees your burden, your care. And he has compassion on you. He doesn't just see situations. He sees you. He knows you by name. And he's filled with compassion for you. Now, this lady wasn't looking for Jesus. We don't even know exactly. This was fairly early in Jesus' ministry, it looks like, from Luke chapter 7. We don't even know if she knows Jesus. She certainly wasn't looking for him to swoop in and to do something here. Jesus arrived, and he had compassion, and he acted on that compassion even without being looked for. Because he did it out of his caring and his compassion. He sees. And Jesus comes to her, and he moves up into the situation, and he says to the widow, "Don't cry." Must have seemed like a really strange thing for Jesus to say. How many times have you been to a funeral or a funeral visitation and you've told the person that's in mourning, "Don't cry"? It's very appropriate to cry. It's appropriate to release those emotions. And so it must have seemed really strange for Jesus in that context to say, "Don't cry." It was a situation where she had every right to feel those feelings and to express those feelings. And you and I experience situations where we can experience the same kinds of emotions, where we cry and we have reason to. But I think that Jesus said and could say to her, "Don't cry," because he knew things that she didn't know. That he had a different perspective on the situation. There was many people that felt sorry for this woman. It says there was a crowd of people from the town. There was lots of people. She wasn't alone. There were lots of people walking with her and feeling sorry for her and feeling pity for her. But that's really about as far as they could go. It's the same as you and I for each other. We can feel sympathy or empathy with somebody else and feel sad for them, but there's only so much we can do. That was not the case for Jesus. Jesus knew that he could do more. And he went further than just having pity or just having compassion on this woman. He saw the problem and he did something about it. And so we see an incredible display of Jesus' power here in verses 14 and 15. And you have to try and imagine the scene a little bit. Again, if we thought it was strange for Jesus to say at a funeral, "Don't cry," the things that are about to happen are even more strange. Where he comes up and he interrupts this procession as they're walking down towards the cemetery, and it says he walks up, and it says he touched the coffin. In the Jewish tradition, these coffins were usually open coffins. And so he walked up and he touched the coffin and he spoke to the boy. He says, "Young man, I tell you, get up." And those who were there witnessing this firsthand, if they thought that Jesus was crazy earlier on for saying, "Don't cry," they must have thought he was really insane now for saying, who is this guy telling this dead person to get up? This is crazy. We've never seen anything like this before. And maybe as they were thinking that thought, or maybe even as they were indignant or angry or feeling like they needed to come to the defense of this widow lady, this boy sits up and starts talking. This young man, this one who is supposed to be dead, sits up and begins to speak. So we can only imagine what the feelings and thoughts of the people that were there were. Verse 16 tells us a couple that there was a sense of awe, there was a sense of fear of the Lord, and that it led to praising. It led to joy of praising the Lord for this. I'm sure there were lots of other emotions there that aren't written down or recorded. Confusion, amazement, not being able to believe what was really happening, that they were actually seeing this. And that's, I think, what happens when Jesus comes on the scene in our lives, where there's things that we can't do, where there's things that are impossible for us, where we can only go so far in helping and supporting and in doing things for ourselves or for our children. When Jesus arrives on the scene, he can do things that amaze, that astonish us, and that lead to praise, that lead to saying, praise you, God, thank you, and an incredible joy that comes from that. The disciples that were traveling with Jesus, and it says there was a large crowd of people that were traveling with Jesus as well, they'd seen a lot of things so far. As they've been following Jesus, they had seen and heard great teaching, amazing teaching with authority. They have seen people be healed. They've seen miracles happen. They had not yet seen anyone raised from the dead, not from the Luke text anyway. And here, not only did they see a dead boy being raised back to life, but they saw the character of God in Jesus. They saw the compassion that was behind it. They saw the love that Jesus had for this woman who had suffered so much. They saw God. Sometimes Jesus shows up in our lives and does things that are so amazing that it's so obvious it's his power. He can do things that no one else can do. Things we can't do for ourselves, things we can't do for others. And yet, it's not so much the miracle or the work that Jesus does that should amaze us as much as it is his love and compassion. That's what drives him. That's who he is. He loves us so much and he has so much compassion for us that it drives him and motivates him to do that. And out of that, he also reveals his power and the power of God, the nature of God, and draws people to him. There may be people here who are hurting as we speak, that your children are struggling with different things, struggling with relationship issues, with marriages, with other relationships. You're concerned about the situation that your child is in. Maybe your child is struggling with depression or mental illness, or some kind of physical illness, health issues. Maybe you've got a child that seems to be far away from the Lord right now and is living in rebellion to the Lord. And being the loving parent, the loving mother and father that you are, you're concerned. You're carrying a heavy burden because of it. There's a lot of talk these days about who's caring for the caregiver. I don't know if you've heard a lot of this talk too, as we hear about firefighters and paramedics and police officers and military people that are coming back after helping people, but they're suffering from that PTSD. They've seen so much and they've experienced so many things in helping others and trying to care for others that they're affected themselves. Who cares for the caregiver? I think we can ask the same question for mothers. Mothers are such caregivers of us, and they carry such heavy burdens for us. How are we caring for them? Who's caring for the mothers? Well, part of the answer is that all of us should be, but we're imperfect, and the reality is that we can't do it. We take them for granted. We're imperfect in that. And like the people, like the crowd that was leading that lady to the cemetery, there's only so much we can do. But Jesus can be the caregiver. Jesus sees you like he saw that widow at Nain. Jesus knows your name. He knows your sorrows. He knows the burden that you're carrying. And he cares and he acts. When Jesus arrives on the scene, he can completely transform the situations that we're in. Like he did in this story, he can change a funeral into a party. And I don't know what you're facing right now, what struggle it is that you're facing, but he can come in and out of his love and compassion for you, he can change that situation. If we let him and if we allow him to. What Jesus did that day in Nain, he can do in our lives. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for your incredible compassion, for your love that is unconditional, for your power that knows no boundaries. And thank you that you care for us and you want to work and act in our situations. God, help us to have faith in you and trust you and entrust ourselves and our children into your hands.